Actually, I was prepared to introduce myself, so I'll just go ahead and do that a little bit anyway. I'm the director of the James M. Cox Jr. Center for International Mass Communication Research in the Grady College of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of Georgia, and it's a pleasure to be here with you. I'm going to talk to you about some research that I've done in collaboration with a former master's student of ours who is also from China. And the research we did was for the Kettering Foundation, which is a foundation located outside of Dayton in Kettering, Ohio. It's a foundation that actually has its resources as a result of a man named Charles Kettering, who invented the starter for the automobile industry. Went on and became Delco, but he was an inventor, an innovator. But the foundation has a focus not only on innovation, but on what they call deliberative democracy. That is, they're very interested in how people talk to each other about things going on in civic life and how that deliberation leads to resolution of community issues. And in the process of trying to understand that, they've been trying to also focus on what role journalists and journalism play in fostering deliberative democracy. So they asked us to do something for them, and that was to review the public opinion research that exists that tells us how the public evaluates journalists, journalism, and the work that journalists do, media institutions. And they asked us to do that more than a year ago, actually before the campaign started. Political campaign just completed, started. But that campaign has actually made more important the work that we have done. So what we were asked to do by Kettering was simply try to understand what public opinion told us about how people assess the media, and try to understand to the best we can why the public feels the way it does, or more particularly what the media might do, have done, that might influence the way the public assesses how journalists work and how media institutions operate. So I said the campaign's important because what's one of the most striking features of the Trump campaign was his very early and his persistent attacks on the media. And this has been particularly strident in the week that we've had Trump as our president. Came to the head, of course, with his argument that the media were distorting the crowd size, and particularly, in his view, providing false information that Obama's crowds, particularly in 2008, were much larger than the crowd that was in his inaugural address. And yesterday, Steve Bannon actually told the media to shut up, okay? He said the media should keep their mouths shut, and specifically said, he said, the media has zero integrity, zero intelligence, and no hard work. So this is very strident, and the point I want to make is that it would be almost impossible to imagine that kind of attack on the press 20 or 30 years ago. All right? But we can imagine it today because the public holds the media in such low regard. A very good friend of mine, a retired professor at the University of Minnesota named Phil Titchener, posted on his Facebook page earlier this week that this will backfire on Trump, and he used the example of Richard Nixon and his attacks on the press. And I didn't write back to Phil, but I think he's wrong because he misses the point that when Nixon attacked the press, he was attacking the press, a press that had very strong public support. And when Trump is attacking the press, he's attacking a press that doesn't have very strong support. And you can have whatever opinion you want about how good Trump is as a president or will be as a president, but I think we all need to recognize that this is someone who is extraordinarily good at playing crowds. And he learned very early on that his attacks on the press produced applause and that he could build on that, and he has used that throughout his campaign. A colleague of ours named Sonia West has written an article that is in the New York Times this week, in which she argues that one of the reasons why the media should be fearful of Trump's attack on the press is because of the very low popular support for the media. She says that, in fact, one of the things that we have to understand is it's actually relatively little legal protection for the media, for journalists. Much of it has to do with social norms and customs. And one of the things that's so different right now is the public holds the media in such low regard. So I told you that this project for Kettering preceded the attacks by Trump. So he wasn't using our data. I don't think he uses any data. I think he uses crowd response to learn most of what he thinks the public believes, and he's been successful with that. But the project actually speaks to Trump and Trump and his campaign in a fairly interesting way. So what we started out with was the observation that the low level of support for the press is actually fairly well documented. And there are two surveys that Gallup does, and which are publicly released every year. One of them is a survey that's called the Governance Survey. And in the most recent survey, that survey found that only 32% of the US adult population had a great deal or fair amount of confidence in the mass media when it comes to, and this is part of the question, reporting news fully, accurately, and fairly. And this was the lowest level that had ever been reported. Gallup also does another survey called the Confidence Survey. It's confidence in institutions. And it found that those in 2016, the most recent year, that those who expressed a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in newspapers was only 20%, and in television news was only 21%. And again, both of those are historically low figures. Now, these two surveys are fairly widely known, and one of the things that we wanted to do was to determine the extent to which the findings from these two Gallup surveys were matched by other surveys or were outliers. So these are the three things that we tried to do in our project, that is MT and I. We asked, are the two Gallup surveys are unusual, or do other surveys of American public opinion show roughly the same picture? Do the declines in public confidence in media deviate from the declines in other institutions? That is, are the media exceptional? And if the declines are exceptional or different from those of other institutions, how might we explain those deviations? Okay? So those were the three things that drove our analysis and that drive this presentation. Our expectations were that we would find consistency in the public opinion research. We also expected there to be declines in other institutions in society, because that's what Gallup has reported in most of the work it's done. And we expected that we would be able to determine what produced the deviations, that is the differences between the media declines and the other declines, by looking at what it was that the media were doing, specifically by looking at some of the same things that Professor Hollifield was just talking about, namely investment in the media product. So our methodology was pretty simple. We went into survey archives, relying heavily on archives at Cornell University, the Roper Center archives, but also the archives at the University of Michigan, the University of North Carolina, all of which house public opinion research going back into, with great detail, going back into the 70s, but also earlier. So what we were trying to do is find out if the Gallup surveys were matched by other surveys. We also gathered data about media investments in news gathering. Again, this speaks to the same kind of issue that Professor Hollifield was just talking about. What we were trying to find out is if those investments in data gathering helped us explain why the media were different, if they were different from the other institutions in terms of their assessments. So I'm only going to show you a couple charts that speak to really the first of the questions, and that is, what do we know beyond the Gallup data about how the media are assessed. There's another survey with a very long history. And I should say these Gallup data go back into the 70s. This survey does as well. It's a general social survey. You might well have encountered the general social survey in some of your readings. It's conducted at the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago. It's a very, very long history of tracking fixed questions. And one of the things it asks is about confidence in the press and in TV. And you can see the downward trend consistent across time. Another survey we looked at was another survey by Gallup, which asked about honesty and ethical standards of TV reporters and newspaper reporters. So this is getting away from the institutional assessment to the individual level assessment of reporters. Again, you can see a consistent pattern of decline. Another survey we looked at was from the Pew Research Center. And this question is, do you have a favorable or mostly favorable opinion of the news media? Again, the pictures of decline. Two more Pew surveys I'm going to talk about. One of them asks about, do news organizations get the facts straight? And again, the picture is of decline across time. And finally, are journalists highly professional? And you see the pictures of decline. In our report, we wrote that it hardly matters how you ask the question. You get the same answer. And that is, the public is very critical of the media, and they're very critical of journalists, of journalism, of journalistic organizations. So clearly, the first of our expectations was supported. That is, the Gallup data are not exceptional. They show the same thing as other surveys, or other surveys support them. We also found, and the data that I presented don't speak to this, you'll have to trust me, or let me give you a copy of the paper, that the media organizations are not alone in decreasing assessment by the public, that many, many institutions also are negatively evaluated and have become increasingly negatively evaluated. And that tells you actually something that is fairly important. The institutions that are negatively evaluated are particularly those of government. And we in journalism like to think that we are in opposition to major institutions, that we are a fourth estate, that we stand and have a critical stance against major institutions, and particularly the governmental institutions. And the public doesn't see it that way. The public sees the media as part of the major institutional structure of this society. And they see those institutions as declining in terms of their trust and the confidence they place in them, and they put the media in the same category. We also, as I told you, looked at how the media deviated in terms of their assessment from the assessments made of other institutions. We created a deviation score. That is, we summed across all institutions, and then we looked at the way that the media were evaluated in the context of other institutions. That produced what's called a deviation score, and we correlated that with such things as investment in the journalistic product, primarily by looking at personnel, that is the size of news forces. But we also looked at profit margins and other things that were similar. And that leads us to these conclusions these summary points that I have here on the screen. That is, that the media is very critical of the journalist and of the media. It doesn't matter how you ask the question. The actual performance of those in journalism and journalistic organizations is viewed critically by citizens in this country. It's actually, we know this is actually true in other countries around the world as well, but this analysis focuses on the US. The public has become more critical across time. Journalists and news organizations, however, are not alone in how they're assessed. Other institutions are assessed negatively. Public is particularly critical of government institutions such as Congress, judicial branch, and the executive branch of the federal government. And they've gotten more negative across time. But the last point is very important. not all occupations and institutions are evaluated negatively. So there are exceptions to the rule, but journalism and journalists are not exceptions. In comparison with other occupations and institutions, journalists and news media actually have experienced smaller declines in recent years than those other institutions. In other words, people have become slightly less critical of journalists and media organizations than they have of other institutions overall. But this pattern of change is not linked across time to what we expected it to be linked to, that is, investment in the media product. We also found that use of the news media is in sharp decline, paralleling these declines in assessment of journalists and journalistic organizations. I think we all know that's the case, but we looked at the correlations. They're very strong. They positively correlated, meaning the declines behave in the same way, but we don't know which comes first. So this leads us to some conclusions, but let me give you some caveats first. First of all, we are concerned about the measures. There's a problem in tracking public assessments of institutions across time, and that is the institutions change, but if you change the way the questions are worded, you won't know whether you're measuring changes in question wording or changes in the underlying phenomenon. So when we talk about the mass media today, we know that that doesn't mean the same thing as it did back in the 1970s when these questions were first asked. If you talk about newspapers and television, it doesn't mean the same thing. But the questions are the same because if you change the question, you won't know whether you're getting a different answer because you changed the question or whether the underlying meaning changed. So that's really important. There's also another issue in that the questions say the mass media are journalists. And as Professor Hollifield just talked about, in this country, there's a very, very different kind of journalistic landscape, media landscape now, from what was true when these questions were first asked in 1970. So if I ask you, do you trust Fox News? And I ask you, do you trust CNN? Those are two rather different questions. You're likely to answer them differently depending upon what your political ideology is. But back in 1970, if I asked, do you trust CBS, NBC, and ABC, they were all producing pretty much the same kind of product. Okay? So to reify television in 1970 is quite different than is the case if you reify television today. And most of the questions actually presume the kind of mainstream notion of what journalism is and what the mass media are. But we know that that's not the case. There's some data that were just released by Pew this week, maybe late last week, that showed that if you compare Clinton voters and Trump voters in terms of their media habits, there's one really striking difference, and that is that Trump voters depend and relied on very, very heavily on Fox, okay? But Clinton voters had a much broader mix. Fox was part of the mix, a small part of the mix, but they're much more likely to have paid attention to a broader mix of media products. Trump voters focus almost entirely on Fox. So that's one of the caveats. And then related to that about measurement is there's a whole idea of reification. That is, what does mass media mean in an environment in which communication is so split, so diverse, has so many different meanings? Does that pick up social media or not? We don't know how people are responding to that question. But keeping those in mind, what we conclude is that what can be done, if anything, to reverse the trends and use of assessments of the media on the part of the public isn't at all clear from our data analysis. What I think is clear is that democracy cannot function if its citizens do not have information about the world in which they live. And we have a crisis because people don't have a high regard for the primary sources of that information. And we need to try to find some way to address that. So my view is that this probably includes both improvements in how people assess the media, and we have to try to figure out how to restore some sense of confidence and trust. But we also have to consider other ways in which we might foster communication in our communities. And that probably means trying to find ways for community members themselves to engage in disseminating information, rather than relying entirely on the established media organizations to do that. Thank you very much. I'd be glad to answer any questions you have. Sure. Yes. Yes.
She asked us to repeat the question.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ann. You asked why these gaps appear. So she asked why the gaps appear in the charts. Because there was no measurement those years. Okay. So it's not so obvious the issue with this one, but like here. So what we have is we have measurement, but there are gaps in it, and so the lines aren't connected. But each of those is a data point. There's simply no line bringing them together because of the gaps in the measurement. So that's a very interesting point. The measures from the General Social Survey, from the Gallup surveys, are the ones that are most consistent across time. And those are the ones that we relied on for the deviation score analyses and for the correlational analyses resulting from them, because they are so consistent. They've been measured so many times. So where you see holes in the chart, they're because there was no measurement. Thanks. Good question. Yeah. Someone else? Yes.
When those holes throw the whole thing off though?
You could have had a spike one year.
It could have been that one year you didn't measure it could have been.
That's a good question. So what you have to do is try to see beyond that. In other words, like, it's possible that there's a spike in there, but the overall trend is, in this case, a slightly negative one. So it means that even if what you said is true, and it's possible that it is, the overall pattern is of decline. Okay? So that's the only way that, without the other data, that's the only thing we can look at is, to look at the overall pattern. Okay? Yes, please. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't repeat that question. He asked if the spikes might not distort the interpretation. And my answer was, because the overall pattern is the same, it's probably not the case. Sorry, I didn't repeat the question. Yes?
Yeah, I was curious about if you have any interpretation as to why, the American public has come to this decline of trust. I know that that's not the objective of your study, but what would be some interpretations that you may have about this situation?
So he asked if I could explain the overall declines in assessment of institutions. And excuse me, I wish I had an answer to that. The speculation that I know of is that the increasing distance between the electorate and most of the institutions that are being measured here. A sense on the part of the institutions that the people are not responsive, and a part of the people that the institutions are not responsive, and that's a long-standing pattern of decline. That is, that it simply has become less of a connection between the institutions and the people themselves. So the society's gotten larger, more complex, communities gotten more diverse. The need for something to keep people in touch is there, but our things haven't changed. Our society hasn't changed. And in fact, if we look at, use Congress as just an example, what's happened actually has made that worse. We used to have districting based on what was called communities of interest. right? You tried to create a map so that people who were part of a community had one person who was their representative. But as a result of the actions of the parties to keep themselves in power, they've engaged in what we call gerrymandering. That is, creating districts that are not made up of communities of interest, but they're made up of clusters of people who are likely to vote for either Democrats or Republicans. So that's just one kind of example of this across time deterioration of the link between the electorate and the elected officials. So I don't know what the case is here. Ann and I live outside of Clark County, but Clark County, where Athens, Clark County's unified government, where the University of Georgia is located, is a blue county, has been a blue county across time, and been Democratic. But it used to be in its own congressional district. John Barrow was elected from that district. To get rid of Barrow, they split the district in half, pushed him down ultimately so that he became a Savannah and Augusta representative, and then finally got rid of him. But that is they being the Republicans, because the Republicans are in power. So that's just an example. Now Athens, Clark County is divided between two Republican representatives, one of whom is Jody Heiss, who replaced Paul Brown, who is one of the most conservative members of the congressional delegation. So that community of interest that is Athens is now split, and I think, no, I'm pretty confident that it's many people in Athens would say they have no congressional representation. Okay, so that's just one example that I think answers your question. And then you would say that has happened with other kinds of institutions as well. So that's the congressional level. You can look at what happens at the city council level. That's also been changed by the Republicans in Athens, Clark County. And I'm using Republicans, but the Democrats did the same thing when the Democrats were in power. And I don't think this is going to be fixed until we get districting away from the parties and turn it over to nonpartisans who are interested in trying to reestablish communities of interest. In terms of the media, the media have also gotten more distant from the communities that they cover. So, I mean, I'm being very speculative here, but you ask. You know, the media had gotten larger, and consequently the people who came in were professionals who didn't live in the community, and you know, they saw themselves, particularly in television, they were only in a market in order to move to a larger market. And if they never learned anything about that market, it didn't matter. It was only whether they were getting good enough to get the ratings up to get out of the market to go to another market. So we had created a media system where all the journalists were really itinerants, right? I mean, they were not committed to the communities. You know, historically, journalists were locally based and part of the communities. We went to a professional model that removed journalists from the communities. So my general feeling is that if we looked at all of these examples, we would find cases that suggested that what's happened is the distance between the institution and the people that those institutions are supposed to be connected to has gotten greater. Long-winded, I hope it's responsive at least. Thank you. Anything else? Well, I thank you for your attention. If I don't know if I got to the last page, but I do have one copy which I can leave with Professor Schau. I can send it to you electronically. If anybody would like to have a copy of the paper, just let me know. This paper is a slight update of the Kettering paper. We updated it with adding the 2016 data. They don't change anything. You can actually go to the Kettering website and simply search for my name under working papers. There are two papers there. One of them is this, and another is a more recent paper I did for Kettering on journalism education and adaptations in curriculum. But you would find this paper on the Kettering website. It's downloadable free. It's under, it's called Working Paper Publications. But you can also send me an email, and I'll be glad to send either or both of them to you.
again,